Hello everyone and welcome to the video covering chapter 5 of our text. Like all of the former videos, this video is not meant to be all-inclusive. The text covers a number of different topics, including some of the early invasions of North America, what early work looked like in North America. It also looked at the slave trade and kind of the history of the revolution of women in early America, and then kind of building up towards the Constitution. But one section of the chapter focuses on social welfare in colonial America, and that's the section I'm going to focus on for this short video, just to help us keep that center focus as we're talking about kind of the evolution of social welfare. All of the other pieces are extremely important to read and understand in context, but I just wanted to draw special attention to this section. So please go through and read all of those other pieces. You will find that this chapter is looking at America through a very real lens. I don't know how many history classes folks have had coming up to this point, but I do feel like sometimes we look back on the history of America with these rose-colored glasses and we forget about some of the atrocities that have occurred on our own soil by our own hands. And this chapter looks at some of those pretty bluntly. So I encourage you to kind of read this chapter with an open mind and think about our history and think about it sincerely and wholeheartedly and kind of feel your way through this chapter. As I read through about some of the treatment of how we just how we cared for each other or how we didn't care for each other through this chapter, it's it's kind of disheartening, but at the same time it's heartening to think about how far we've come as a society as well. So anyways, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and kind of shift my focus to the content. So one of the things I want to talk about are the idea of the poor laws coming to America. So in the last chapter, we talked about the Elizabethan poor laws. So early colonial America brought those ideas with them. And so we had the American poor laws, and we're talking about the early 1600s at this point. And so the poor laws, if you recall, in theory are basically the state saying that we need to take some responsibility for the care of our citizens. All right, so they're coming out and stating that we, the government, have some level of care that we should be providing. Okay. And so that sounds all good at a really high level, but in terms of how that was actually carried out is very different. And then it also looks very different between Europe and America. So in England, one difference is that they had an overabundance of workers. Okay, so in England, unemployment was high, there was high levels of poverty, vagrancy, crime. In America, because we're at the beginnings of starting our country, there was not a scarcity of work, right? Workers were highly sought after. In theory, everyone had the ability to work and was highly encouraged to, right? There had to be a lot of hard work and sweat and tears to build kind of something from nothing. In England, there was a really clear definition of class stratification. And as we previously talked about, there was this idea of the noblesse oblige, who are responsible for taking care of charity. In America, we didn't really have that, right? We left England to kind of start this new country, and so there wasn't as much stratification here. There were individuals who were coming and kind of starting anew, and so in a sense, upward mobility was really limited by effort. And there wasn't like a pre-established charity network that was here. And so in essence, private charities were kind of inconsequential in early America. There's also this this kind of religious shift as well, kind of in both England and America. But you need to remember that kind of historically religion stepped in to kind of save the poor, right? That was kind of one of their key ideologies, is that they had a responsibility to the poor, to take care of the poor. But now there is an insistence on individual effort, and religion ended up decrying the poor of relief, and said that it contributed to the spiritual degradation of the poor. So we talked about this, and we've alluded to it, but this is coming from the Protestant Reformation, and this idea of work ethic. And people who were not able to abide by the idea of work ethic were punished. They were driven out, they were deported, they were hanged. So remember, work equals godliness. Not being able to work and poverty was a sign that you are not a chosen individual, and were thus ungodly. So that it's kind of like a weird idea to coexist, right? That work is godliness, but there's also this idea that that wealth and condition were kind of divinely ordained as well. So so there's this kind of weird dichotomy that coexist. Individuals who were poor or paupers were considered morally deficient because of their inability to work, to the point where they had to self-identify, or the city or the state would identify them. In some cases, paupers even had to wear a P on their clothing, kind of similar to the Scarlet Letter, which you may be aware of. So they had to be publicly identified, and they were outcast by the community, morally deficient. There is still this idea of the worthy versus the unworthy poor, but the idea of the worthy poor is a very, very slim concept. Okay, and part of that reason is going back to the Protestant work ethic, and just kind of the tone of early colonial America, is that everyone has an equal chance, and everyone needs to kind of put in their effort to build this thing. And so if you weren't working, if you weren't contributing, then you weren't held you weren't held in very high esteem, right? You were not considered worthy, especially if you were able-bodied. So so there were very few worthy poor, and those were the individuals who were receiving that initial social welfare from the colonies. One of the earliest groups that was kind of identified as the worthy poor, and this seemed to cross the colonies, were veterans. So veterans were some of the first groups that were pretty readily identified as being worthy of social welfare, and the welfare they received was generally through pensions. And there's a term that I want you just to latch on. You're going to hear the term outdoor relief. So I just want to kind of clarify what that means. So social welfare can take many forms, and one of those forms is institutional social welfare. So you'll read about and have heard about almshouses before. You're familiar with the idea of asylums, right? These are institutional forms of social welfare. So outdoor relief was the ability for an individual to receive some sort of financial compensation or food relief or something like that, but be able to realistically just kind of live out their life outside of an institution. So these veterans could remain in their own home and remain with their families and still be receiving aid from the state, whereas prior to outdoor relief, most welfare was tied to those institutional movements. In colonial America, there's this idea of kind of local responsibility, and individuals who were to receive some sort of assistance, they had to be investigated by those local entities to determine whether or not they were even worthy of aid. The book talks about it in Plymouth, for example, in 1642. At this time, every case had to be discussed at a town meeting. So I want you to think about that, for example, if that were to carry on in today's society. So if you had a family that was struggling, especially even think about it um, uh, for the families who are affected by COVID, right? You have a family who fell in hard times. They had to apply for assistance. Maybe that was financial assistance. Maybe it was unemployment. Maybe it was food stamps. Maybe it was Medicaid or something like that. Now, granted, there are a lot more social welfare programs that exist today that you can apply for than what there were in early colonial America. But every single case that was applied for had to be discussed and approved in a town meeting. Okay, so the extreme vetting process, and as you might guess, like very few people met the criteria to receive that aid. It was meant to the process was meant to dissuade people from pursuing that aid. Um, one thing you also see is a form of means testing. We talked about this really early on, but in order to even be eligible for aid, there was a citizenship requirement regarding either owning your own property or living in an area for a given amount of time. So if you did not own your own property, or if you've not been there for a while and you were living in this community and you were applying for aid, then you were not eligible. And oftentimes you were highly mistreated, and communities had the option to completely just push you out. Okay, so think about that too, just for a stark contrast. If you had someone that came to Evansville, okay, we're trying to have a modern comparison. They came to Evansville, they fell in hard times, they weren't able to find work, and they applied for aid. This would be the equivalent of Evansville saying, well, I'm really sorry, but you haven't been here long enough. You haven't contributed, so we're going to send you down the river, right? We're gonna send you somewhere else because we're not going to deal with you. And that's what communities did, right? They pushed poverty out, physically pushed poverty out, not through policy and legislation. They were anyone who was a drain on their community, they pushed away. So something to remember there. Also, it's important to think about how families um, played a factor in kind of early treatment of individuals of poverty, um, and those who are unable to work as well. Um, in early colonial America, family provided this idea of social control for religio political government. So this idea that the government and this idea of the separation of the church and state didn't really exist at the time, right? Um, so when we're thinking about that, and we're thinking about all of the pieces that are impacting the individuals through the Protestant work ethic, this idea of the worthy versus the unworthy poor, those who were living in poverty were considered unholy and ungodly, and that God must have smited them, right, to put them in the position that they are in. The family became kind of responsible for dealing with those family members that were being that were in those conditions, right? So the family responsibility became such that they were to ensure that their members would not become dependents on the government. Okay, um, because if they did, if you were a family and you had a member of your family that was impoverished and became a drain on the government, and they became a dependent on the government, then that cast a really long shadow on your family, right? It'd make it really hard for the rest of your family to gain a foothold, to gain wealth, to gain class potentially. So there was got almost a kind of an inward hate at times of families that had these members that were a drain, to the point that families were given kind of an ultimate freedom to deal with these individuals however they saw fit. The book talks about the fact that they were given really kind of ultimate freedom all the way up to the point of murder, but not to exceed murder, right? which is really crazy to think about because um, the point of murder stops because it is somehow the line, I guess, in the sand of saying crossing this line would be um, religiously unwanted and sinful, right? But all the other treatment kind of up to that point is fine. And so what families would potentially do at times is they would take these members of their own family who are a drain on themselves and on their community, and they would just kind of leave them to the elements. The book talks about some families would even chain up their family members and let the elements take them, right? They would starve, they would become dehydrated. Um, so it's hard to think about um, that kind of treatment, but that's how the kind of unwanted were dealt with at this time. Um, you also again see this classification system of the poor. So in early colonial America and under the American poor laws, you saw the impotent poor, the able-bodied poor, and dependent children. So the impotent poor, these were the individuals that I was just talking about. These are the ones that were the big burdens on the family. The able-bodied poor, these individuals were considered to be against God's will. Um, to some extent, if you are an unabled body, there was at least some degree of understanding that that you can't control your situation, right? And so they still work and looked at as burdens. But if you're able-bodied, you could work, then your lack of a quote unquote like willingness to work, um, that made you ungodly as well, and so you were looked at in a very dark manner. And then there was also this idea of dependent children, and again, dependent children, the definition is a lot different. Um, what we're referring to in colonial America versus now. Um, so with the children, there was this concern that if you are a child, especially if you are a child from a family that was already skirting poverty or living in poverty, that there was a fear that the children would also fall into that same lifestyle, that same life of idleness and poverty, and would be a further drain on the system and on the government. And uh, so dependent children whose families could not adequately take care of them, they were bonded out for service. Oftentimes, they were sent to trades. The courts could essentially kind of indenture them to servitude, and they would do so the um, under the belief that there was a contagion of parental failure, as the book puts it. Um, so the parents were not able to provide what they could for their children, and so the courts ultimately took the children, but they didn't provide them, you know, uh, like a high lifestyle. What they really did is they put them um, into slavery through indentured servitude, right? Um, so think about all these things. Okay, I'm not going to go into a lot more depth here in this video, but I just want to draw your attention to how social welfare looked really, really different in early America. Okay, now the book, past what I'm talking about, does start working us towards the Constitution. Primarily, where I was hanging out was in the 1600s. Um, so things will progressively get better and better and better, but think about, as you're reading through this, some of these concepts in early America that still find their way to trickle into modern times, right? This idea of the worthy versus unworthy being one of those kind of key pieces, and the way that some individuals in society look at individuals who who aren't working, whether that's because they're unable to work, or if they're kind of a victim of circumstance or whatever. There are a lot of people in our society still that that equate that that non-working individual to be something ungodly at times, right? Or whatever. So think about how you see the kind of this early treatment filter through to modern times as well. So, okay, I'm going to end the video here. I appreciate you guys watching. Sorry, I feel like this video is a little more stark and dark compared to some of the others, and hopefully they get brighter as we go. But it's really important that we understand this history so that we aren't doomed to repeat it in the future. All right, thank you guys. I appreciate you.